Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you had a nice lunch and also a good opportunity to network. I think it's also part of the feel-good spirit, the fact that none of us has had much of a chance to network over the last 18 months. So it feels good to see people and have lunch with people again. I'm sure you're refreshed and ready to kick off our afternoon, which promises to be very informative. But I would also invite you, and particularly folks online, to make sure you do send us your questions so that we can raise them with our speakers, with the presentations, but later on in the afternoon also for our panel. So now we will look at how we fill the research gaps, some of which have been identified this morning. And for that, I will give the floor to the person who has the delicate task of keeping everybody awake after lunch, and that's always a bit of a challenge. So welcome Alex Morrow, who's the coordinator of STAR-IDAZ Secretariat. Good afternoon, and over to you.
Madam Chairperson, many thanks. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Johannes for the invitation to speak here. And several people have mentioned STAR-IDAZ during their presentations this morning. So what I want to do is to briefly give you an overview of STAR-IDAZ, and then how it evolved into the International Research Consortium, what the objectives and deliverables are, the partners structure that we operate under, and then look at some of the priority topics and how we're approaching organizing the research needs into research roadmaps. And the whole idea of research roadmaps was mentioned earlier on by Diana this morning as well in relation to helminth infections. So STAR-IDAZ, it's a global initiative to improve coordination of animal disease research, looking at the major infectious disease of livestock and zoonosis, to hasten the delivery of improved control methods. We've got partners throughout the world. In total, it evolved from the STAR-IDAZ International Research Consortium, evolved from the original STAR-IDAZ project, which was an EU-funded project. And that project had about 25 partners, but then we also had set up regional networks, which we still operate. So we've got a regional network for Africa and the Middle East, one for the Americas, one for Asia, Australasia, and they complement the existing collaborative working group on animal health and welfare research within Europe. So the CWG within Europe is basically the European regional network of STAR-IDAZ. So the total outreach is about 50 countries through that network. As I said, the IRC builds on the STAR-IDAZ global network that was formed in that original EU-funded project. To take it forward in the IRC, we looked at different structures. And there was one on rare diseases in humans, and we followed their governance structure fairly closely. And there they said to be a partner in the IRC, an organization should have a research investment of about 10 million over a 5-year period. In other words, about 5 million per year. So about 2 million per year to come to the 10 million over a 5-year period. We don't exclude smaller groups. They could come together. And I will show you examples of where smaller organizations have come together as regional networks. The important thing is in the IRC is that there's agreed delivery targets. They're all working towards the same objectives. Agree to coordinate or align the funding to deliver these targets. So you're talking about members' own funding, unless agreed otherwise. So we have actually looked at, or sometimes think about trying to run coordinated research calls. Agree to share information. This is really important. But of course, intellectual property has to be protected as well, and we recognize that. So as you saw earlier on, we've at the IRC level, we've got 28 partners from 18 countries, that includes the European Commission. And across our partners, we reckon they've got a combined 5-year research budget for research in areas of interest to us of about 2.5 billion. So if we can help coordinate a fraction of that, it would be quite an achievement. I mentioned smaller organizations wouldn't be excluded that can come together as regional networks or groups. And a good example of that is number 9, the regional consortium from Belgium, which involves different animal health research players within Belgium. And another example is number 24, the regional consortium for Nigeria. So basically, the objective is to coordinate research at international level to contribute to new and improved animal health strategies for major diseases, infections, or issues. Things like antimicrobial resistance. Okay. And the target deliverables would include candidate vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, other animal health products and procedures, or key pieces of scientific information that are important for disease control and risk analysis. The structure that I mentioned, so the partners actually form the IRC Executive Committee. It used to meet once a year. Currently, we're meeting about 3 times per year, virtually, because it hasn't been possible to meet in person. The Executive Committee is advised by a 16-member scientific committee with members from the different disciplines, but also from around the world. So we've got people from the Americas, from Europe, from Africa, and soon from Asia as well. And then to take priority topics forward, we look at existing groups that may be functioning in relation to some specific diseases. I'll come back to those later. Or we would look at setting up working groups to identify what are the research needs or what are the knowledge gaps that need to be addressed in developing new animal health products. Some of the priority topics are listed there. All of that structure then is underpinned by an EU-supported funded secretariat, which I've been leading. That also involves OIE, and we've got somebody based there full-time in OIE. It involves Animal Health Europe, and Johannes is involved, so that gives the link with DISCONTOOLS. And also CAVI and Research Council in the UK, and therefore where I used to work. In terms of the priorities, well, number 1, what we're trying to do is to coordinate what people are actually funding and give them so that they're not duplicating and get better value from what they're doing. So basically, priorities are identified by our partners. So sometimes that could be following horizon scanning or foresight activities. So we would then look to actually set up working groups or work with existing working groups in those areas. So for example, for foot and mouth disease, there's the Global Foot and Mouth Disease Research Alliance. So we take the knowledge gaps they've identified and look at how they can be structured into a roadmap. For African swine fever, there's the Global African Swine Fever Research Alliance. I'm on the executive committee of it. LERO was mentioned for livestock helminths research, was mentioned earlier on today. And of course, GRAB TB was also mentioned, which we're involved in setting up. And of course, there are also the expert groups that function for DISCONTOOLS, identifying what are the needs. So research gaps are identified. Then either at workshops or reports or have already been identified by DISCONTOOLS. We structure those into research roadmaps, which I'll show you later. And these get discussed with the working group, either workshops or virtually. And then what we're keen to do is to actually map ongoing research onto those roadmaps. So we've got a clear picture of who is addressing what challenges. And we're trying to get the research community to upload their project detail, but otherwise we also look at databases and get information from other networks. And all of that will then identify where there are actually gaps in the knowledge which are not being addressed, and hopefully that will feed into new research calls. Some of the key topics that were mentioned that we've been working on in PRRS and pigs, influenza, where we've recently commissioned a report on what has been achieved since previous gap analysis, and I think it's quite interesting where the report concluded that following the gap analysis conducted in 2013 and 2014-15 by USDA, EFSA, and the European Commission, they reckon that of the thousands of papers that have been produced over the past 6 years, only about 10% actually address the knowledge gaps that were identified in those research gap analyses that were conducted back 2013 to 15. Bovine tuberculosis, another priority topic, foot and mouth disease, brucellosis, African swine fever, vector-borne diseases, helminths, including antibiotic resistance. But we're also cross-cutting issues such as vaccinology. So we're currently, I've got somebody developing a paper looking at vaccine platforms and their attributes and in relation to what our requirements are. So basically, are they suitable for mass vaccination, thermostability, all that sort of stuff. Easily adapted, whatever. Emerging issues as well. Diagnostics. Again, what we're hoping to do here is looking at what technologies are out there that could be repurposed for use in diagnostics. And then also alternatives to antimicrobials. It's not just about coordinating internationally, it's also about coordinating along the innovation pipeline. And of course, ideally, you'd start with a target product, diagnostic, vaccine, or scientific, or piece of information you need, and you work back the way. So it's about coordination from basic science through to the delivery of products. And how we approach that is basically you've got a lead. So you know you'd like a vaccine for African swine fever or whatever, and then there might be different options. There's you've got a lead, you need a vaccine for disease X, there's a need. And there'll be needs like it's got to be suitable for mass vaccination or whatever. There'll be the challenges, things like attenuated vaccines could revert to virulence, so all that sort of stuff. So you work back the way. I'll show you how it builds up in relation to vaccine development. So these research roadmaps are a way to visualize complex problems. They provide a structure and focus on where research is needed, identifying bottlenecks and critical gaps. We see them as interactive living tools publicly available on our website. And the idea is that they provide a resource, not just for the funders, but also for the research community. And as I see it, they actually write for the people their pathways to impact, almost for their grant proposals. So here's the vaccine research roadmap, and you can see on the right-hand column, there are different options for vaccine development, naturally attenuated candidates or nucleic acid-based ones. And of course, with the helminths earlier on today, the attenuated ones were blanked out, and they concentrated on the nucleic acid and subunit approaches. Of course, behind that, key steps will be attenuated organisms, identifying suitable adjuvants, identity of protective antigens, absolutely essential if you're going to develop a vector vaccine. For attenuated vaccines, obviously the identity of virulence factors becomes important, immunomodulators, and the whole host pathogen interaction. Behind each one of those boxes in that last slide, so behind each one of these boxes, there are then these lead summaries where we ask basically the research question, what are you trying to achieve? Challenges, what are the scientific and technological challenges? Solution routes, what it depends on, usually more basic science. So if you want to develop a vector vaccine, well, then you need to know the protective antigens. And then state of the art, and this is where we're trying to capture some of the key pieces of information that are known relating to that challenge, and then projects we're hoping to try and capture, ongoing projects that are addressing the challenges listed. Good example here is an African swine fever one from the roadmap there. So maybe we want a cross-protective ASF vaccine, preventing disease, virus transmission, and carrier state. And it'll depend on things like development of an attenuated vaccine that doesn't persist or is excreted. So, and then further back in that chain, development of rationally attenuated vaccines that are safe, effective, and prevents transmission. And dependency as well, you've got a genetically stable modified attenuated organism. If one had gone down a vector vaccine approach, then the identity of the protective antigens would be key. And all of that appears on our website in this form. And you can click on the different boxes and it takes you to the information relating to specific disease. And we've done a similar thing for a diagnostic test development and for therapeutic development. And then there's an overarching one for disease control strategies. So the diagnostics bit feeds in there through box 7, vaccines feed in through box 3A, etc. And those generic roadmaps we had published in Transboundary and Emerging Diseases, September of last year. This was shown earlier on. The Helmut people have done a great job. They have produced roadmaps for liver fluke and nematode vaccine development, also for liver fluke and nematode disease control strategies. And they've also looked at Helmut diagnostics and Helmut therapeutics. They have then actually gone on to map the current projects that are being carried out that address the challenges identified in these roadmaps. So they're a model of, a really good model of how the whole thing could be taken forward. We're looking at developing roadmaps for some other areas as well. So vector-borne disease as well, okay, if it's a virus, so bluetongue virus, that would fall into the vaccine development for virus. But then there are other issues. You know, the vector is often not just a flying syringe. They're actively involved in the transmission process. So we developed, this is a draft roadmap for vector transmission and control. The top line in blue, that's basically how you might control the vector at the host level. The middle box is in reddish color. That's how you might modulate the transmission of the pathogen. And then down the bottom is basically control of the vector in the environment. And we're hoping to take that forward with the research community to develop the lead summaries a bit more. We do have draft lead summaries for it. Similar roadmaps have been developed for alternatives to antibiotics, phage technology, taking it forward, manipulation of the microbiome, and immunomodulation. And we've got a series of workshops ongoing at present to identify the research needs there and develop the lead summaries for those. So if you want further information, you can contact myself or Madeline, or go to our website, or Robert, or Valeria at OIE. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alex. So do we have questions from the room? I think everybody's pretty well aware of what you do and how you do it. So no questions? Okay, so we'll just move on. So our next session will also look at cooperation, and we will look in more detail at the European Partnership for Animal Health and Welfare, also known as EU-PAW, as we've seen mentioned or heard mentioned before earlier today. And to tell us about where we stand and what our priorities are, we have two speakers again for this particular session, which I suppose you will be taking turns as well. So very good. So I'm happy to welcome Jean-Charles Cavit, who's the Research Policy Officer of DG Agri at the European Commission, and Hein Imberecht, who's the coordinator of EU-PAW application at Cienzano here in Belgium. So, gentlemen, welcome. At least one of you so far.
Yes, I can try this. Okay. So, first of all, before starting presenting those slides, I have a few messages. Let's say, first of all, if we would have enough money at EU level or in the Commission to fund anything needed about the endless list of gaps we heard about this morning, I would not be here presenting something like what you will hear about the partnership. Another thing is, I would not address some people from the industry sector here if I would not hear from time to time that our EU research projects hardly end up in commercial products, and the results finish in the shelves of laboratories or entities. So we would like to change this. and enable more of a kind of public-private partnership, not maybe exactly like what we heard this morning from Nigel Swift, but something that would facilitate and enable uptake of research results by the industry, and we will have to think of how we can do it well. And another thing is, for those who know about previous initiatives at EU level, public-public partnerships like ERANETS, you have to take into account that those ERANETS as EU-funded projects are basically coming to an end. We have ICRAT, but that will be the last one. ERANET as such will cease to exist in the Horizon Europe. So what I will bring here for the partnership on animal health and welfare is not a silver bullet. It's under construction, but we hope we can come safely to a harbor for that partnership in the coming few months and years. So, and just to illustrate the thing is finally that looking, if we compare to the medical sector, when for an emerging threat, which is important, COVID, the Commission together with other actors put billions. For an emergency that was highlighted this morning for African swine fever, we put millions, okay? And we have many species and many issues. So we need to leverage and get as much impact as possible with what we want to do and what we will try to do in the Horizon Europe. So towards this European partnership on animal health and welfare, so it's a co-presentation in a way, and you see in the title, European Commission and the collaborating working group of the SCAR on animal health and welfare, because as Commission, we can put forward the, let's say, the framework conditions to establish a partnership, but it's up to the future actors to define what has to be done and how it should be done, together with us, where we can advise. So first, why addressing animal health and welfare, despite the big discussion about One Health? Animal health and welfare are a valuable topic on its own. Not all animal diseases are zoonotic, but there are important diseases for animals that are not zoonotic as well. And here you have a list. I will not go very long into this list. You know about this, but the economic role of livestock production in Europe, the loss due in animal productivity and animal production due to infectious animal diseases, the threat from exotic diseases due to climate change and other drivers, let's say. Also the increasing trend in emergence of novel zoonotic pathogens. And also, of course, the economical trade impact, consumer confidence, etc. So I think it's very important. Of course, it was also mentioned the issue of the public health dimension, if we think of zoonosis, but also antimicrobial resistance, which is for the moment essentially seen as a public health issue, not an animal health issue. So if we look at the regulatory environment for animal health and welfare and what we could aim at, we have obviously the Sustainable Development Goals at global level with 2 SDGs that I mentioned on zero hunger and good health and well-being, which are maybe the most relevant SDGs for what we want to do in animal health and welfare. But we have also at European level the Green Deal with the farm to fork approach. For those who come from the EU, you will hear about this, with, for instance, a target to reduce the use of antimicrobials in livestock production by 50% until 2030. Quantitative target, political target set up in the farm to fork strategy, but also the review and the strengthening of animal welfare framework at EU level. Of course, we have the new animal health and welfare, or especially animal health regulatory framework that is coming up now, and obviously the EU action plan to fight against AMR. And a lot of what we can do on animal health and welfare, be it diagnostics, surveillance, vaccines, etc., can contribute a lot to the fight against antimicrobial resistance. So why such a partnership? And it will be a partnership under Horizon Europe, so as a research and innovation partnership. Obviously, no single member state has the capacity on its own to address all the challenges faced. There is a lot of duplication in the member states in the public research activities because on regulated issues, there is an interest to manage diseases and be prepared to manage disease in each country, but that leads to sometimes, or maybe often, useless duplication of work. Sometimes insufficient industry interest because there is not necessarily an obvious market for the industry to develop certain products or services. We see also, somebody spoke about digitization, the digital needs in animal health and welfare and in agriculture in general, but there are also important issue of the data management. And also looking at the development and validation of products and a continuum that we would like to strengthen between basic research up to really innovation at higher tier level. So I think it's important to have this idea.
I'm sorry, because you turn your head, I'm going to shift the microphone a little bit because apparently our online, yes, our online audience.
So we think that a partnership, an ambitious partnership approach is deserved in this area. Now, why a partnership? And it will be a co-funded partnership. So we heard earlier about public-private partnership. This partnership, as intended for the moment, is a co-funded partnership. It will be essentially a public-public partnership, but where we would like to have an involvement and a strong involvement of the private sector, the industry. But in public-public partnerships, we have a history of relatively successful partnerships with a succession of ERANET, EMIDA, ANIWA, for those who know, and now ICRAD on international cooperation on research on infectious animal diseases, with mobilization of quite significant amount of money on research. 70 million were mobilized in several years in joint calls for these two ERANETs. Now ICRAD, this ERANET has launched a first call with, I think, 12 or 13 projects selected. Over 20 million euros were put into this, and there is a second call being organized. Now we have the SCAR, Collaborative Working Group on Animal Health and Welfare. I will not give all the details of this, but there are more than 20 countries in there. And this is the backbone on which we prepare this partnership with actors outside the Commission, obviously. And you heard about the International Research Consortium, STAR-IDAZ. We have DISCONTOOLS, again, for gap analysis. But obviously, beyond analyzing and identify gaps, the question is, of course, how do we fill those gaps with limited amount of money? And there are various types of partnerships that are foreseen in Horizon Europe, the framework program for research and innovation in the EU. You have the co-programmed instruments, you have the co-funded instruments, and the institutional partnerships. The co-program is just kind of memorandum of understanding where, let's say, the private sector would do certain things and the Commission would commit to do other things through projects in the framework program. It's quite loose, I would say. Then you have the co-funded partnership, which is more usually like a public-public partnership. The co-program would be more typically public-private. The co-funded partnership is based on a joint program agreed by the partners. And it's a kind of mega project within which a number of things can be done. So there will be a grant agreement signed between the consortium of the partnership and the Commission. So the member states agree, design and agree on a common program to be implemented, the responsibility. And the private sector can be associated, but normally will not be a part of the partnership itself, will be more a stakeholder or possibly involved in projects launched by the partnership itself. And the institutionalized partnership are like, for those who know the Innovative Medicine Initiative projects, IMI, which can be public-public or public-private. In that case, for IMI, it's public-private, but it's very, very constraining. And this idea for animal health was discarded from the beginning. Now, these are the 49 partnerships that are planned at Horizon Europe for the first 4 years of Horizon Europe, 21 to 24. And here, if you look at the fourth column, if you can read it, cluster 6, food, bioeconomy, and agriculture, You have the list of partnerships foreseen, and you have here animal health and welfare planned as a co-funded partnership for the first 4 years. We plan to have it, if we are ready, for the work program 23-24 that we are starting to build, and we hope to have it for the call of 2023. And the timeline is really tight to finalize the preparation of that partnership. So in a co-funded partnership, again, the member states and associated countries, and possibly non-EU countries, design a common program. There is a grant agreement, as I said. Now, the big difference with collaborative projects, like you have like VAC-DIVA, etc., where basically the European Commission funds up to 100% of the research done. In a co-funded partnership, the Commission will bring part of the money only. It's by default 30%. It can be higher in certain circumstances, but by default, it's 30%, which means that 70% has to come by the countries in the partnership or by entities, research entities that will be also in the consortium itself. Call for proposals are organized by the partnership, and the beneficiaries are basically funded at national level, with exceptions. There could be, let's say, charities also in the consortium, not necessarily countries, but usually it's countries. So country national funders or regional funders will fund the participants. And we need to define from the beginning which would be the partners in the partnership consortium, and then stakeholders that provide strong input for priority setting, and that's what we would expect from the industry, at least. And also stakeholders and target group addressed and involved in the activities implemented. So industry possibly being part of research projects, otherwise performed by mostly by the public research sector. The scope of the partnership we have in mind, animal infectious diseases, including their impact on public health and animal welfare. It would cover livestock, terrestrial and aquatic. It would cover, where relevant, wildlife, and even companion animals where relevant, if there is a risk to animal health or a risk to public health. The aim is listed here: preparedness, promote and strengthen animal welfare, generate innovative methodologies and products. It's in red because that's maybe one of the domains where industry and private sector would be very relevant. Support evidence-based policy making. The partnerships under Horizon Europe have to have an impact. It's very impact-driven. And in their impact, it can be an impact for the society, but it's also impact for policy. So to accompany policy implementation and development. And that's why I mentioned the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, for instance, before. And strengthen the European research area and leverage resources. If we have the 30% co-funding, the expectation is that by bringing this, we bring also the 70% from the national or other funders, so that we have a bigger amount of money to perform research. And the impact is, well, this is quite obvious: reduce socioeconomic and environmental impact of animal infectious disease, improve animal welfare, protect economic viability of farms, produce safe food, and be beneficial for public health. This, I will not go through this because I hope there will be time for Hein to go in detail through this. But this is a kind of logical framework of what we have in mind for this partnership at the moment, where we have the kind of drivers, general, specific, and operational objectives, in which you will find here surveillance, diagnostics, vaccines, farming practices, and this kind of aspects. What is important and what is a real constraint for us and a real challenge is, for all these objectives, we need to have smart objectives, measurable, time-bound, and we even need to have indicators to demonstrate that we progress towards certain targets and reaching those objectives. And that's maybe in some cases the private sector and industry could be also important to help us to define those measurable objectives or targets and indicators. Typically, this is just as kind of information to illustrate what I was saying before. The consortium members within the partnership itself, we see that the research, European research centers working on infectious animal disease and animal welfare would be part of it. national and EU reference laboratories also, and we would need, obviously, funding agencies. If we don't have funding from the countries, then we don't have a partnership. And as stakeholders, probably in a number of cases, it will be universities or this kind of research entities, but also relevant industry partners or their association, and other relevant stakeholders and initiatives and agencies like EFSA, EMA, OIE, or advisory services. Well, this is I will not go through this, it would take too much time, but this is to say that we started already in 2019. So it's now 2 years that we work on this with different developments. What I can say is that we started already to associate and discuss, have exploratory discussions with the private sector and industry, with Animal Health Europe, Diagnostic for Animals at different stages. And the preliminary, let's say, version of the dossier for the partnership was shared and discussed with those entities. And the timeline now for this co-funded partnership for the work program 23-24, basically, we have to finalize a dossier that gives the big aspects, the larger aspects of the partnership by the end of this year. In parallel, we need to develop a strategic research and innovation agenda that we need to initiate this year. We will have a bit more time to develop and finalize it. At the end of the day, the strategic research and innovation agenda of the partnership will be the core element that will describe which activities, when, how they will be implemented for the duration of the partnership, more or less. And that is being initiated now to get this, and probably also consultation of the industry, let's say private sector, would be important at some stage in the development of this. And I think this is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much. So Hein, over to you.
To more or less the vision of how we see the added value of the partnership for the moment, and again the bold text. Of course, build a strong research and innovation framework for improving animal health and animal welfare standards. I think that's nothing new. Protection of health of animals, and including where needed and where appropriate of humans. And then we say also that we want to coordinate it's not something that well, we want to work together with both public-private networks of collaboration efforts of most of the actors in Europe. We want to bring them together. So this is the vision that we have for the moment in this partnership. We started with a number of, to practically start to work, we started with a number of working groups. And if you look at the green, the surveillance, diagnostics, farm practices, treatments, vaccines, well, these are the vertical, I would say, vertical silos where we are, where the researchers, the experts are doing the preparatory work. At the same time, we identified as well fish or aqua pathologies, let's say, on one hand, and AMR as key elements in this in the working groups. And so we have, let's say, 4 vertical and 2 horizontal working groups that all construct to the content, to what are we going to do, what is the content of the partnership. If we work to this vision that we have, then we have these different working groups dealing with the surveillance, with the diagnostics, with the treatment vaccines, and with the farm practice that all work together to that vision. And what we are, the content, what the content of the partnership would look like is something like knowledge. So we want to do research, of course. We want to introduce new technologies, omics, let's say, in to diagnostics, for instance, or vaccines, dealing with big data, epidemiological data, laboratory data, data management and data sharing, fairness of data is certainly an important element. Standardization of tests to come to comparable data and comparable epidemiological data all over Europe, for instance, and diagnostics, the need for diagnostics, the reference material, and so on. That's all what is included in these in the four working groups, also about wildlife and antimicrobial resistance. A key point, you heard the word intervention logic. This is really, I don't go into detail, but this is really important. We want to make sure that in fine, the partnership has an added value. So have to look at, identify the needs. What are the needs for the moment that, for instance, are defined by the Commission or by working groups or by organizations like OIE or whatever? What are the needs? And based on that, what activities can be developed? And if we develop activities, then we will have some, like in other all projects, we will have some deliverables, results, outputs. And then the next step is these outputs, these deliverables, how can they be taken up by other laboratories or risk assessors and so on, the outcomes and then the impact. So this reasoning of starting from needs to impact, that's something that we really want to stress. This slide, very busy, there are only three words that are important. One is dossier, the first word, dossier for the partnership. That's what we're working on now. It should be finished by the end of the year. And so that's the four working groups that are giving input to this, both on the what, the content, what are we going to do, and the how, the organization. Come back to that a little bit later. There is the strategic research and innovation agenda, which details more the activities in the context of this framework of intervention logic that I just explained. And then only then afterwards, there will be the proposal. So the proposal, the document that will, where the consortium will say exactly what I will do in the coming years, somewhere starting end 2023 or beginning 24, that will be the proposal. So what we are doing now for the moment is preparing this, and that's the dossier. Jean-Charles already showed this slide. I will quickly run through this. We have on top the drivers, steep drivers, societal, technological, economic, environmental and political drivers, and therefore they are immediately linked to the global, the general objectives. The general objectives are the three on the second line: preparedness, animal welfare, and cross-sector collaboration. You could say One Health. I think these are, I think you agree that these are keywords that we heard this morning when other people also were talking about priorities and gaps. So this is certainly something that we want to do as a general objective. Whereas the green part, the more specific objectives that are related with outcomes taken up, then we think about the facilitation of the collaboration. We have to work together. Second, we have to do research, and three, we have to take care that what we developed, it will be taken up. So this taken up by other researchers, taken up by policy, taken up by industry, and so on. So this is, and then on the bottom line, the orange thing are the operational objectives. They have to be linked with specific deliverables, products or pre-products or antigens or procedures or so. So this is the logic that we have developed in this. As Jean-Charles already told, there is a lot of networks existing, companies existing, partners that we have identified, and all these have to, or those that are interested to take part in it, have to find their place within the organization. And the organization, it may look a little bit difficult, but the example that the Commission gives is on the right and top. So it is rather difficult, but this is because this is a large project and there's a lot of partners. Have to do. Will there be actors? Will there be stakeholders? Will there be members or observers? All that has to be clarified. So it's the role of universities, the role of the industry has to be defined, and this is just one start of the discussion. Now, I only have a few minutes, maybe more. I won't go into detail. This is very complex, but I wanted to show is 4 slides with the way that the working groups are moving forward, and they're using indeed this intervention logic from needs to what the possible impact can be. For instance, on the introduction of new technologies within the diagnostics, also on capacity building. For instance, if there are no networks on certain infectious diseases, then this may lead to non-harmonized results, tests that are not harmonized. So this capacity building, harmonization of tests is certainly an important element. Also, prevention and control. When we talk about treatment and vaccines, prevention and control is important. What the working group suggests is working on vaccines, innovative vaccines, and also immunomodulators, and giving support was identified as an objective of the partnership as well, giving support to regulatory aspects to define more, to come up with more details that can support authorization of products, development of assays, and right on the top is also this name of thing where a product is authorized for a certain animal species. Maybe there is only little investment needed to use this product as well, authorize this product as well in other species. So this is the idea which is behind. And then this last slide, I think that
yes, because it was a kind of opportunity today to address not only to academic people, but also to the industry, is to see what the role of industry. As I said, this partnership intrinsically is a co-funded partnership, so it's typically public-public partnership. But we want to see how we can reinforce the link and the involvement of the industry into this. So to say that what can we do, commission, or maybe in the public sector research, what can we do in this partnership to facilitate, ensure uptake of research and development outputs into products and services? And reversely, what can the industry do for the partnership and get more impact of what we do traditionally in public funded research? To say that in the preparatory phase that we are in for the moment, European federations were consulted at several steps and were invited, and if I remember, we took part in the webinar that we organized in June this year. When I say federations, meaning Animal Health Europe and Diagnostic for Animals, essentially. We have experts in the working groups that come from either directly those federations or who are near this domain, and some of these experts are in this room today, and especially for the working group 2 on diagnostics or the working group 4 on vaccines and treatments. Now, what we would expect, possibly, we will have to discuss very, very soon. We will discuss very soon the possible contribution of the private sector organizations, let's say, to an extended core group to work on the dossier that I mentioned just before. And also, as I mentioned earlier, maybe in the development of the strategic research and innovation agenda. But it will also depend how much the industry is interested to contribute and is interested to be involved in the partnership. So what further support could we expect, let's say, or could we ask until the proposal is formally submitted? And it will be formally submitted end of next year or maybe beginning of the 2023. And then in the implementation phase, because that's probably the most important. And we will need to reflect. So these are questions, essentially. We need to reflect together with the different actors, including industry actors, and discuss to advance this dossier also. So what kind of advice can we have on research priorities and or modalities? And I think we would probably have to discuss with federations more than with companies themselves, that the industry, private sector could be part of projects launched by the partnership, and probably selected through external calls. And then companies could be part of these projects, research projects. How far could the private sector, being federations, companies, I have a bit of doubts, but we can see. It could be discussed if we have the opportunity to discuss it. Assessing maybe submitted projects. If we want the industry to have a say to make sure that, like Nigel Swift highlighted this morning, that we don't end up with research projects that cannot be used by the industry because the way the research was done cannot be exploited by the sector. And so maybe assessing deliverables. These are question marks, really. We could discuss this. And also, could we foresee federations or companies as really research funders, not providing not providing in-kind contribution within projects in which they are, like we do for typical collaborative projects, but also thinking of ways to maybe sponsor, or I don't know what, but really as kind of funders. But that has never been discussed. It's really a question mark, and that's among the questions that we have and we would be happy to discuss. So I guess we will not have replies today, but you can think about it for those who are from the private sector. Thank you.
You may not have replies, but I'm sure you'll have questions. So could I maybe invite you to come back to the stand, Hein, and see if we have questions in the room for either of you or both of you? I know it's a tough time. It's the after lunch slot. You know, it's called the graveyard slot. So there's a good reason for that.
To say we don't need to have questions now, but if we don't have comments or questions, we will only progress with our own ideas. And that will be a problem.
Be warned. Yes.
Jean-Charles, that system that you elaborated here together with Hein, how does that resemble the American system? How do they tackle the whole disease problem and the cooperation with the industries and all? You people must have looked at other countries, how they do it as well.
First, the framework conditions, I did not establish them. They are there, and they were established by the Council and the member states. And if it is so demanding with what I mentioned about smart objectives, indicators, etc., it's because and the Commission and the member states authorities asked for that. They wanted to get rid of the ERANETs, and they brought this kind of things. So if it is complex, it's not my fault.
No, I don't say it's complex. I don't say it's complex. That I didn't say. But I say, did you get the mustard from another country, from the United States or from some Asia? Or
we worked on this. They were built those three ideas and instruments of partnership, co-programmed, co-funded, institutionalized, are built mostly on what was existing before an Horizon 2020 or even before. The institutional partnerships, it's exactly copy-paste of what led to IMI, the Innovative Medicine, okay? The co-programmed is based essentially of what was called contractual public-private partnerships under Horizon 2020, essentially public-private industry. You want to build airplanes, batteries, whatever, this is the kind of things typically. The co-funded instrument is essentially based on what we, on a system on which we selected the European Joint Program One Health, which Hein is the coordinator of, which is essentially, it can be either a mega ERANET, if there is a lot of money and a lot of external calls, or it can be like EGP One Health doing a lot of research within consortium members. So these are the instruments that were based more or less on existing systems we had. We didn't, I don't think anybody copied or looked at what was there in the US or somewhere else.
to put it in another question, in a certain sense, in the United States, research in the laboratory, do you think it doesn't stay in the drawer, but it goes quicker to the industry? How do they manage that? It's an impression that I have, but it's probably not true. I don't know if it is true. But I have the impression America, everything is quickly commercialized and
The only thing I can say, and I know a little bit, is that the links to the industry are there, but the funding of the industry by public research is not there in the US. How is it? Here, we fund industry sometimes in our research projects, but the connection with commercialization is not there. Why? Well, it's not there. It's not always there. And it's better and better because we want more and more the industry to be in collaborative projects like VACDIVA and other projects as well. But this is something, yeah, I cannot explain. Quite frankly, I cannot explain why. I just see.
We have a question at the back there and then at the front here.
Do you have a contact and relationship with the European Medicine Agency to be sure that the different studies could be in compliance with what is requested after for a marketing authorization dossier? Because it's a topic important today. We have several academia research are not used for marketing dossier. And second question. What do you think about what is made in human sector with after the COVID and the package EU for health or concerning the ERA, the new agency for emergency disease, and all the program of research and innovation in that domain? And if I want to understand, the sector of animal health is excluded, and in the future could do things that we can hope that will also be concern animal health sector?
I'm not sure I will reply directly to your question. On EMA first, we would like and we intend to have them as stakeholder, maybe on an advisory board, this kind of how we will, construct, how we will operationalize the partnership with partners and stakeholders, etc. We will start the discussion very, very soon, actually next Monday. For the moment, we ask working group to think of what we want to achieve, what activities, etc. But how we operationalize that. And as part of the operationalization, we want to have entities like EMA, probably EIDAS, EFSA, and these kind of things that can help us, and probably, I hope, maybe industry, for them to influence the way the research will be done in the partnership so that it is useful and it can be used as best. So that's a hope, how we do it. EMA was invited to the webinar we organized in June. But we did not manage for the moment to have a real dialogue with IMA, with somebody who would have some time and to devote to working on this. But clearly we will need those kind of entities to make sure that we have this dialogue. Now, you speak about medical sector. As I said, when we put at commission level 2 or 3 billion euros for COVID, we put 10 million for an ASF vaccine. Okay. One Health and the COVID changed completely the perspective. And the medical sector is putting One Health everywhere. Everybody is putting One Health everywhere, actually. But never we will have this kind of mobilization and money available for animal health, except if it's zoonosis. And we want to work into the One Health perspective. But then what do we do with ASF, with FMD, with lumpy skin disease, with etc. So I think that it would be a dream to think that we will mobilize billions of money on this thing for animal health. And even if Horizon Europe has more money to work on environment and agriculture research, so the cake is bigger, to keep it simple. The priorities, there are many other priorities that animal health: biodiversity, soil and climate change, One Health to some extent, etc. So the cake has to be split in much more pieces. And the question is what will be there for animal health and welfare out of these cakes, looking at all the other priorities. So I would not be very optimistic into thinking of a possible increase of public research funding at EU level on animal health.
I'm sorry, we have, yes, of course, go ahead. Yeah.
I add just a little thing. The problem with the partnership for the moment is we are developing this dossier, which is the first step, which is what are we going to do? And if we don't have a good view on what exactly will be in there, it will be difficult for the member states to say yes or no, we are interested. It will be difficult for industrial partners also to say yes or no, for the international organization. So we are a little bit in this time frame, which is very, very tight, and that makes it difficult. Okay.
Yeah, no, but I'm afraid we're going to move to the next question, but if you want to continue discussing that, of course, we have a coffee break and I'm sure you can talk it over on that occasion. And while you bring the microphone, I have a short question actually. Is there a blueprint or will there be a blueprint for PPPs so that each partnership doesn't start from scratch all over again?
We have kind of guidelines on how a dossier should look like and what is possible in a partnership and what is not, depending on the instruments. So that's, I don't know if you can call it really a blueprint, but each partnership is different, really. Even co-funded, you will have a partnership like the Rescuing Biodiversity Partnership, which is really organizing all of its activities by external calls, like a mega ERANET, for those who know ERANET. And then you have a partnership like PARC, about chemical risk assessment, that will do, like EGP1Ls is doing, virtually everything within the partnership consortium itself. So each partnership is really very different, so it's difficult to say that we can build easily a blueprint for even for co-funded partnerships. But we have some, as I said, the framework conditions are strict and complex.
Thank you. Our last question.
Yes, thank you very much for the nice presentation. We had previously the presentation from Alex Morley on STAR-IDAZ, and now we have this one. And maybe I missed it, but will there be a connection between the two? Because of course they also already set priority. They also have some partners, funders from the EU countries. So will there be a collaboration and not a competition between the two?
Certainly not a competition. Actually, STAR-IDAZ IRC is a soft mechanism for coordination. The STAR-IDAZ itself does not has money other than for the secretariat. So that's one thing. The partnership will bring really money for doing research. That's one thing. Second is the partnership as we see it, even if it's not yet clear how much it will be open to international cooperation, but at least as an EU, even if it would be Eurocentric, that partnership could be one of an implementing element to help filling the gaps identified by the IRC, STAR-IDAZ IRC. In part, not only IRC, because the partnership will have its own strategic research and innovation agenda, and it will depend on what also the member states are ready to fund. But I see that the partnership in health and welfare probably has more as an European arm to help implementing, filling the gaps, as we said. That's why we have this session here. From the IRC, but also from what will be defined in the collaborative working group of SCAR, which is putting together delegates from member states to discuss on how to coordinate research activities, public research activities in the EU and in Europe. So I don't see really a competition, more, well, hopefully a kind of win-win, if we could say so.
Right, I have a final question, if you can give us a quick answer, but it's from one of our online audience members. How would the preparation for a pandemic response with Agent X fit into this framework?
That's part of the thing we need to discuss, probably also with industry. I think as part of the preparedness, my dream would be to see whether in the partnership we can develop platforms, vaccine platforms, for a quick reaction. The nice thing, in a way, I should not say so because I work in the Commission, but the nice thing with a partnership is that then the consortium will decide, basically on a yearly basis, on what they want to do, based on a roadmap and a strategic research agenda, but there will be some flexibility to do things rather than us coming with our work programs where we need 2 years to prepare a topic, and in a topic that has to be quite vague, because we are asked to come with vague descriptions to allow very much bottom-up innovation and research activities. So it will be quite nice to have a reactivity in the partnership, I hope. That would be more than what we can do usually with our work program. You see, for the vaccine on ASF, VacDiva, I mean, it took probably 2 years to discuss, etc., and how we do it, and mobilize the money, and have the topic, and have a project selected. I guess that in a partnership we could do it easily, but the nice thing would be to develop things where we can react quickly, and platforms would be very, very nice.
Good.
And an added value at pan-European level. Yeah? Not only one country, one company doing something, but also of added value at European level. But,
So you added
well, it's
your
a dream
part.
for the moment.
You added your part to the wish list then. Thank you very much, both Hein and Jean-Charles. And we're now going to take a 30 minutes coffee break. It's not going to be quite 30 minutes, it's actually going to be 20 minutes. So we're back here at 3 for the final stretch of our program. See you in a few minutes. Thank you. So welcome back to what is the last stretch of our program, but certainly not the least, because we will hear from our panelists what their views are about how we set disease and cross-cutting priorities, cross-cutting in the sense of across multiple diseases. And for this panel, it's my pleasure to welcome Paula de Vera, who's Senior Policy Advisor at Copa-Cogeca, Nancy de Bruyn, who's the Executive Director of the Federation of Veterinarians of Europe, David John, who's a Senior Technical Manager at Animal Health Europe, Susanne Rasmussen, who's Legislative and Policy Officer at DG Santé in the European Commission, and joining us online is Jonathan Rushton from the University of Liverpool. He's a professor in animal health and food systems economics. Good afternoon, Jonathan. Can you hear us?
I can. Good afternoon, everybody.
Very good. Good afternoon. Jonathan, I'm actually going to stay with you and start with you because you will help us look into the economic aspects of priority settings. And we've talked about the gaps this morning, but how, or the gaps between how we identify our needs and what we prioritize. So what does it take to fill those gaps? And from a more economic point of view?
Thank you, Florence, for that brief introduction. And apologies for not being with you physically today. I tested positive on a PCR test on Saturday morning, which is a false positive. So maybe there should be more money directed towards some diagnostic tests on COVID as well. So let me start by just explaining that I'm going to talk a little bit more carefully about the Global Burden of Animal Disease Programme, which I lead. And I want to go through this in a sort of stepwise process. But if you can go to the next slide, please. I want to recognise the people who've been involved in bringing me to this talk. Can we go to the next slide, please? Sorry. Is somebody going to work the presentation at your end? Yeah, thank you. So we have a range of people who supported this initiative. It's a program that's actually supported by the OIE. We co-lead this with the University of Liverpool. There are various people across Europe who've been involved in it. More recently, we've had a program funded by the H2020 Decide, led by Gerdien van Schreik and colleagues, that was looking at endemic diseases, where we're doing some estimations of the burden of animal disease. And of course, Johannes was instrumental in terms of allowing us to give this talk today. So next slide, please. Now, in my view, and perhaps this isn't coming out very clearly on your sort of presentation, I can't see it particularly well on my screen, but we have a situation where we take decisions about either One Health or animal health issues for our humans, animals, and plants, and we tend to use socioeconomic analysis alongside that, but not very effectively. So next slide, please. Why do we do that? Well, we tend to have slightly different ways of looking at economics. And I think that I've been involved most of my career on this side around animal health approach, where somebody comes to me and asks me, or tells me that a disease is important. They have a strategy already developed and they simply want a justification, an economic justification for that particular strategy for a program to begin. An economist would see this slightly differently. They want to understand the context. They'd want to identify weak resource allocation, understand why it's weak, and then reallocate resources. Next slide, please. And the difference here is where I think there's real confusion about what economists do and what social scientists do and what they should be doing for the animal health world. So the animal health world really wants something that's about advocacy, big numbers about the impact of diseases. They want to actually justify why their ideas are worth funding. Whereas an economist will be asking questions about, is it worthwhile? Are we reaching a stage of optimality? And the way we view that is quite different. And I think one of our challenges is actually to meet halfway. Can we actually get to a more economic approach, but maintain that kind of advocacy approach in addition? Next slide, please. Now, what makes up that health impact? And I think this is one of the tricky things. We've had previous presenters. Diana, you talked a little bit about these invisible losses with fasciola and other parasites. We've also got a whole range of things that cause big losses, which tend to be the big ticket items, things like foot and mouth disease, PPR. The slide that Johanna's presented very clearly indicates which are the big ticket items in this. But when we have these kind of problems, next slide, please, we don't rest easy. We start to spend money. And the issue here is, how do we create a balance? So go to the next slide, please. We need to recognize that there is an impact caused by our diseases directly on the animals that we keep. And there's an impact we cause on society in general, which is about spending money in terms of research, development, coordination at a farm level, but also a societal level, and also the trade restrictions we place on people and the suboptimal use of technologies. Now, again, from an economic perspective, we need to have a balance. Every time we spend €1 on this reaction side, we are trying to avoid losses in our livestock populations. And economists would argue that it's not simply about eradicating diseases, it could be simply about living with diseases. So go to the next slide, please. This has been talked about for probably 50 years by economists in different guises. John McInerney controversially said that animal health is not a biological problem, it's an economic one. And he came up with this relationship between expenditure and production loss, and the fact that there could well be an optimal point of control that is not about eradication, it's actually between the points, and we have to live with disease within that structure. Tisdale modified that a little bit. This graph is not particularly representative of what Tisdale talked about, but Tisdale talked very carefully about the need for really strong fixed cost investments in our research and development part to actually support this technical relationship, which is actually not static. Every time we add a vaccine, we change the shape of this response curve within this structure. And it's important that we recognize when we come to the limits of our technologies and we need to invest further. Next slide, please. So what are we doing in this space? Unfortunately, this slide has not come out very well on this PowerPoint, but we're starting to build an analytical structure, which is very much about improving how we approach the economics of animal health. And this is within the Global Burden of Animal Disease program. Our analytical structure details our livestock populations. We look very carefully at the animal health loss, which is about the difference between current levels of production and expenditure against levels of production without any kind of health issues, then the attribution by disease and health problems and accidents, in order to understand both the absolute burden for each disease, but also its relative contribution to this animal health loss envelope. And finally, thinking more carefully about the impact across the wider economy. Is this being done at the moment? The answer is no, it's not. We tend to do this on a piecemeal basis. We tend to do the work around the absolute burden of diseases, but we do not look at the relative contributions of those diseases, and rarely do we look at the impact across the wider economy. Next slide, please. So we've started off by putting together data, estimating populations, looking at biomass issues. I think Tim put up some nice slides earlier today about the increase in poultry populations, which only captures a part of what's going on here. We can see in the UK there's been a drop in cattle biomass over the years. There's been spikes in sheep populations, then ended by 2001 FMD outbreaks. What's not particularly well captured here is the actual speed of turnover in our chicken population. So the chicken population here is actually a standing population. It doesn't reflect the turnover rate. So actually for every chicken in this group, there'll be 6 other chickens in that year of interest. So I think that's a part that we need to sort of bring into this process more carefully. Next slide, please. And what are we trying to provide in terms of the information here? Again, apologies. The text has not come out as I wanted it to on this slide. But basically, we are thinking more carefully about, can we put a number against this with regards to the total investment in animals? Can we look more carefully at that animal health loss envelope in terms of its makeup in terms of mortality, morbidity, and expenditure? And can we actually then divide that up in terms of what that means in terms of notifiable diseases, endemic diseases, injuries and accidents, and possibly a group of things that are actually unknown that we need more research on? And then finally thinking more carefully about that wider economy aspect with regards producer, consumer, and value chain impacts. Next slide, please. What kind of questions are we trying to answer with that particular process? Well, within that wider population, I'm sure the people in the Commission are very aware that they have a responsibility through the legislation to actually take some responsibility for risk. And therefore, any notifiable disease, it's very important to understand how many animals are at risk and what is their value, to actually understand what that level of exposure actually is. Is that exposure seasonal or is it annual? So are there changes? And we can see with the avian influenza patterns, we have now influenza seasons. When we think about the animal health loss envelope, again, what's the breakup of that loss of production and expenditure between species, between mortality, between morbidity? Have we got the balance right between expenditure and loss in that situation? Moving on to the disease issues, we obviously can prioritize to some extent if we've got more information about different disease impacts. But are we actually providing the right types of technology solutions? Is there more need for research and education to actually get to better resource allocation in that situation? And then finally, in that wider economy aspect, we've had a really nice talk from Bo Ingelheim from our colleague there. He was talking very carefully about that public-private partnership, but what do we really know about public and private expenditure in the animal health world? And have we got that balance correct? Let's go to the next slide, please. So within our GBADS program, we're trying our best to provide 3 critical pieces of information. We want to provide information where we get investment plans that actually provide adequate resources for animal health systems. Once we've got that, we need to think more carefully about how do we allocate that money in terms of the problems that affect more greatly issues around the sustainable development goals, around the health and well-being of people and their animals. And then how do we actually evaluate those animal health investments? Are we setting up data capture and data analysis structures where we end up with a reasonable idea about whether we're getting the reasonable sort of societal outcomes we're seeking, and do we have to make modifications? Next slide, please. And we've been aiming to do this with the OIE, thinking very carefully about how they perform their performance of veterinary services and gap analyses around the world, and how GBADS metrics would actually contribute to that in terms of the information on the burden. We believe that when we do that, we can support investment plans in veterinary services, including research and education. We can get better resource allocation within those budgets and derive improved animal health outcomes. And through a process of collecting data, we can start to evaluate more carefully where we're having success. And I think it's very important to recognize economic analysis should not just be about doing ex-ante analysis, the analysis before an investment takes place. We have to get better at providing ex-post analyses and actually demonstrate we're having success. Economics can provide that. It can show quite clearly where we're getting good returns on investment to actually raise our profile in this situation. Next slide, please. So when I look at the DISCONTOOLS webpage and I sort of see what kind of information is required, I kind of wonder a little bit how this is being collected. I can guess how it's been collected because I've been doing this for about 30 years and I've been involved in this process. But I think what I would really hope is that coming into the future, working with Johannes, we can work more carefully in terms of these wider societal impacts, the impacts on trade issues. So next slide, please. So GBADS, I think, fits very neatly in terms of providing a better basis to actually say something quite constructive in this impact across public health, the wider society and trade. We will be collecting population data, information about the gaps in terms of loss of production and expenditure, and that wider economic impact, but also providing information on individual causes of problems in the health world and also the expenditure to those systems. Next slide, please. Where can you find information about our program? We've recently published an OIE panorama, short pieces, probably about 20 short pieces, about 300 words with different perspectives on what we're actually doing. Next slide, please. And we've got a paper in the next version of the OIE RevTech with regards what our approach is at this particular point in time. There will be subsequent publications coming out from this. Next slide, please. So in the future, where do I hope we go? Well, I want to move that socioeconomic analysis away from being a side aspect of what we do. I hope we can move towards a situation when we have disease problems or health problems, we're doing regular impact assessments of what's actually happening. We use that as a baseline to actually make assessments of interventions, and we improve our One Health decision making. And by presenting this kind of information, we're starting to hit the marks of people who run finance ministries or finance directors of private companies, information about efficiency change, as well as just disease level changes. Next slide, please. I want to recognise that we're funded by different partners, the UK government, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the European Commission have kindly given us money to start doing work in Europe, and the Australian government. And we've got a range of international partners helping us implement this particular programme. Next slide, please. And I just want to recognise the wider team, the GBADS team, who've helped put things together. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand back to Florence, back in Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you. That was a very clear presentation and a very good kickoff to our discussion. And based on what we just heard, I will turn to our panelists, and my first question will be the same question to all four of you. What are your views on this economic aspect of things? And it's kind of a dual question. What are the strengths of DISCONTOOLS and what can we improve? So maybe I'll start with you, Susanna.
Sure, you can do that. But actually, I think that the approach to animal health control has always been economy, so that is not really new. The new thing is that Jonathan also is looking into not regulated diseases for the industry. And I think actually it is very interesting and also useful because there's so many data out there that we can use. And I think that we should look into using all these data that are available. Thank you.
So yeah, you passed on the mic to the right person. That's perfect.
Okay, well, I think I'd have to agree with Susanna, you know, where in animal health, I think I would differentiate where we're talking livestock, it's always been an economic element to it. You know, the companion animal market is slightly different. And I think it does help where we can maybe put this on a firmer footing and a more organized footing, because as we've heard earlier today, you know, in some cases we have the diagnostic tests, but the diagnostic test is so expensive it's never used. And yeah, that's not a solution. So I think it is very important to take the economics into account, and the solution has to be cost efficient for the problem.
Nancy, you have a mic there, so that's probably easier.
Yes, certainly agree. I think it's very important to look at the economic aspects, especially for livestock. Indeed, companion animals are a little bit different. Especially also if we want to invest more in preparedness, because that's a bit the doom of preparedness. If you're doing well in preparedness, you don't see the disease and you don't see the results. So you have to have good numbers to back up why you want to invest in that. So yeah, definitely agree.
Paula.
Yes, so in my case, as the last one, also from, let's say, the practical farmer's perspective, I would completely agree, especially, well, with the three panelists, but especially when David and Nancy were talking about livestock. In livestock, it's essential to have always in mind the economic investment that you will need at, let's say, all aspects of the animal production. But animal health, of course, is one basic pillar, together with animal welfare. Never forget that, both of them. But it's something that I will say that not only from the farmer, for the farmers, that you need, of course, to put money to apply some improvements, to apply new technologies, to let's say improve as much as you can the standards of your farm, but also on the other side, what comes first is the research and the implementation, the development. So in that case, it's a whole chain that will need support in economic terms. I would say it's something that will affect all of us in a holistic way. So yeah, it definitely is a crucial part of this.
So we've been discussing priorities since this morning. Yes, Susanna, did you want to add something on this?
Yeah, I just want to add that actually the preparedness is what I was thinking about, talking about the data, because all the relevant data, they are there, but we don't use them.
Yeah. So as I said, we've been discussing priorities since this morning, and I assume each of you five has different priorities because you come from different backgrounds and you look at things with different perspectives. So you probably have different opinions on what you need to prioritize. But let me start with you, Nancy. We've heard a lot about the One Health concept, and it's certainly essential to veterinarians. So you point out that the health of people, animals, and economic systems are completely interconnected. So what kind of research would you need in order to understand and protect this One Health approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everybody here in the room knows that most of the emergent diseases come from animals. So this aspect is extremely important. For example, in surveillance, we should be better in doing surveillance of diseases, and both on the animal side as in the human side, and bring this data together. We already do it for part on antimicrobial resistance. That's the part where we work mostly together. But even there, we don't have standardized data collection systems, for example, on resistance. So we do already there a lot, but we can do more. We were also quite a lot of examples this morning where people here work on specific diseases, animal diseases, where they say collaboration more with the human colleagues on the same disease would be really useful. So there are still a lot of win-wins we can take. And we see that there has already been progress made, absolutely, also through COVID, but not enough yet. We need more. We need more interdisciplinary, cross-sectorial research. We need more links also on policy level, because there we still see very much that we have two separate fields, the animal health field, the environment field, and the human field. And we need also to work on education, because there it starts. And that's one of the projects as FE we have, bring on board One Health education. So we've gone away, but there's still a far way to go.
Right, and Paula, to touch upon the practical farmer's point of view that you mentioned, are there any specific diseases that should be prioritized in order to find new solutions from the farmer's angle?
Well, of course, right now we all in the room know two big examples that are now roaming through the EU. One is African swine fever, and the other one is avian influenza. But of course, in this regard, I would say first that these two are quite devastating for our, even when avian influenza, let's say, it has a little bit more road, let's say, than African swine fever, advanced already. I think, yeah, those two now are, let's say, the big news that we have. But I wouldn't stop there, let's say. I mean, there are a lot of diseases that, and also some other people, let's say, present in the room will know about that. We have the transboundary diseases that still roam around our borders, not inside the EU, but we have diseases in third countries, even in Europe, Eurasia, that are still waiting for the opportunity to come in. So all of them, we also have to always keep an eye on them because, for example, foot and mouth disease is quite devastating also, even more than, I wouldn't compare, but even sometimes more than African swine fever, for example, because it covers even more species. So we always keep an eye on all those possible diseases that can affect our animals. And we are always compromised to try to put in place, the most and highest levels of biosecurity and protection that we can. It's not always possible, it's not always at hand, it's not always even affordable. We were talking about economics. Sometimes some of the newest techniques are not coming, let's say, accordingly to the pocket of the farmer. But that's something that we are also working together with other stakeholders on that. And let's see if we have promising results in the near future.
Right. Now, David, clearly everybody's been placing high hopes in the use of vaccines in order to better prevent diseases. And at the same time, there seems to be an increasing focus on reducing the use of certain pharmaceuticals in livestock, like antibiotics, anti-parasitics. So how do the industry and the public sector still need to invest in pharmaceutical development? And if so, in which domains?
Well, that's a crystal ball question to a certain extent. If you knew the answer, you could probably make a fortune. But I think, yeah, there is this focus on reducing unnecessary use of the antibiotics, the antiparasitics, and a lot of work has been done there. But we do still need the pharmaceuticals. I'm with the best will in the world, and we've seen it with COVID, with all the preventive measures in place, people have been vaccinated and they've still caught it. So you will still need to treat animals. With the best will in the world, they're going to get sick and need treatment. In terms of where the priorities could be and what is needed, I think there are some obvious areas. In aquaculture is still an area which is very short of medicines. We also heard earlier today from Joseph, there is a need for more new anthelmintics, new antiparasitics. We have the alternatives to antibiotics, and while a lot of those are around the side of reducing the need to use, propping up animals' health status, there is also a need for the actual therapeutic alternative to antibiotics. So I think there is still scope there and there is no need.
Indeed. And Susanna, what's the importance of animal health? I mean, we've been talking about this since this morning, so it's clearly crucial, but how can it work hand in hand with other policy objectives, such as animal welfare or the reduction of antibiotics that we were just talking about?
Well, I'll take it quite basic, because I think animal health is, first of all, very important for the animals. That's for sure. But animal health is also very important for the farmers. And it's especially important for the farmers' economy. And it is also important to provide food for the public. But also, if a farmer has a good herd health, he will use less antibiotics. So this is good for the antimicrobial resistance. But also, if a farmer has a healthy herd, they tend to become bigger, and then it will give some jobs for other industry around the farming. And in the very end, it will also improve the trade between the member states. So it will also impact on the economy for the member states. But also, if you have healthy animals, it will have impact on some elements of animal welfare. not all of them, because it won't have some impact of the physical surroundings of the animals. But if they are healthy, they will still have a better animal welfare.
Yeah, clearly. And Jonathan, I'm not forgetting you, definitely not. So we've heard from our participants, from our panelists, what their views on the economics of the discussion was. Now, looking at the priorities and the various approaches that we've heard about from the economic angle, what are we missing? You know, where do we need to go? What is it that we don't see?
I would argue that from an economic perspective, we are talking a kind of language which economists probably wouldn't really understand. So if we're thinking about this from a farm perspective, then our farmers will be interested in what is it going to cost and what will be the return? What is the efficiency change? If we're talking to a finance minister, then I kind of doubt they might look at the return on investment or the internal rate of return of our particular interventions we're proposing, but they'll be being under pressure to think about labor productivity and job creation. So we need to start thinking about having metrics and having output from our animal health side that starts to talk the language of those economists. If we think about that wider sort of government aspect, and Johanna's raised this quite nicely this morning, we're living in a world of increasing populations, changing human behaviors, and also changing livestock systems, livestock production methods, processing. We need to put it back into a bigger context of thinking about what are these animals actually doing to our environment in terms of potential negative externalities, but also what are the risks from public health about the way we keep animals in terms of emerging disease issues. Now, the only way to get to the heart of some of these things is to have a more systematic approach about how we actually look at the livestock sector. Where are our populations? How are they being kept? What kind of inputs are going into them? Who's responsible for their welfare? Glyn has made a comment, you know, how do we approach this from a zoonotic disease perspective? Well, from my standpoint as an economist, we'd really want to know quite carefully what the negative externalities are to public health and the environment from our livestock sector to actually understand a little bit better where the balance lies between government responsibilities and private responsibilities in that structure. We've got some great examples of not getting this quite right with things like foodborne disease issues. So go back to the 1980s, 1970s in Europe, we had problems with things like salmonella, the emergence of BSE, which required quite strong government intervention to actually manage that process. And I think there are things we can sort of look at more carefully. But what I would say is that without a systematic approach to the economics of livestock production, the value chains that are associated with it, and the animal health world, we will struggle to actually present back a list of things that we need to actually prioritize as a public investment aspect. And also on top of that, within each disease, where we've got limiting technologies, be it through price issues or through the possibility of actually implementing these technologies at farm level, are things that we're not particularly good at actually describing. That might all sound really complicated, and I don't want that to be the case. We're working on this. We're trying to create that kind of systematic framework to actually provide information that will be helpful to groups like DISCONTOOLS and actually add value to the process of what you're doing today in this meeting. So I hope that the future meetings will actually refer back to the context in which the animals are kept and the impacts of the animal diseases we're looking at in slightly more detail in terms of expenditure and production loss. That would be my main aim in terms of moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Paula, we've heard this morning on various or from various speakers that research takes quite a long time before it actually results into a tool that is applicable by farmers. How would you see, what do you think could help speed up the process? Do we need to speed it up? But I should think so. And so in which specific domains and how?
Well, I would say that that's one of the million-dollar questions of the session. Yeah, talking about research applied, let's say, and the relationship research farmers, let's say, how to bridge the gap, let's say, between research and farmers. First of all, I would say that we feel that it's fundamental to bridge that gap, let's say, as much as we can. And with that, I will praise let's say, the network that the European Union has on projects, Horizon 2020, Horizon Europe, etc. We are part of some of those projects. For example, talking about, I will profit the occasion, we participated in the project Disarm to reduce the use of antimicrobials and tackle antimicrobial resistance, just to put an example. And we are probably participating in the future in other projects related also to animal health. So that shows that, of course, we have a willingness to collaborate as much as we can with the research and to provide our expertise from the field in that regard. We feel that in order to, let's say, to get to those tools that could be applicable and also affordable and let's say ready as soon as possible, we feel that, of course, farmers should be involved from the beginning in research projects. And on that, as I said, I think in the EU, we are already one step ahead in the world, in the worldwide context, let's say, and we work very well together, and we are achieving step by step very good things. And yeah, the big question I would say is how to speed up, as you mentioned, the application on the field. I think that not only depends on the research, also I will throw the ball to the Commission on that a little bit. I will be a bit provocative. Also, something that we have said from the farmer's perspective for a long time is that, yeah, maybe we have to find a way to speed it up also on the legislative process, let's say, let's say, during the assessment, risk assessment, efficacy assessment, readiness assessment, etc. And that also comes from the EU institutions. So I think, as I mentioned, it's like a bubble where we are all interconnected and we have to all put our sand grain to go forward.
So Susanna, do you want to catch the ball that has just been thrown to you by Paula and talk about the time it takes and how the Commission could help speed up those processes?
I can't catch that ball. Paul, you already heard my colleague Jean-Charles tell you that things takes time and there are funds in the Commission. Yes, that's true. Actually, I'm not so involved in them. It's much more DG Agri and the DG RD. So I'm sorry, I can't really play with that ball for you.
It's okay. We've taken note of the question. I think that probably you can raise it maybe with Jean-Charles if he's still around, and if he's okay to discuss it at the end of our session with you. Yes, Nancy, you wanted to.
Yeah, I just wanted to come into that one because I think it's a very important one. And if we look, for example, at vaccines and medicines, many of them are now authorized per country. So that means that in some countries you have a very big toolbox to treat your animals, while in others, like if you're a small country with not a lot of animals, you have hardly anything. And this, for example, would be an easy method to have a sort of single market for medicines, and also vaccines would make immediately that you have a lot more available. And that's a very concrete example, I think, what would help. On the priorities, just to echo what David John said, I think it's very important to realize, even if we keep an animal in the best conditions with very good feeding, with good biosecurity, they can become sick. So we will always need both vaccines, but also therapeutics to treat the animals and to stop the disease. Another prioritization, like African swine fever vaccine, would be the cherry on the cake there. But another very important one, what was mentioned a lot priority, is diagnostics. We need a lot more effective diagnostics that do not take too long, ideal pen side, but okay, and that are not too expensive. So more investment there definitely has to be made. And then coming to the last point mentioned by Paula, it's really important that research is translated into a usable instrument for veterinarians and farmers, because there's so much good research done, but it never reaches the target audience. And that's just a waste of money and yeah, resources. It's such a pity. So we need to involve indeed farmers and animal owners and veterinarians from the start to make sure that you have in the end something that is usable on the farm and will be used.
Mm-hmm. David, picking up on what both Paula and Nancy just said, we've heard about vaccines earlier on. We've heard about various prevention tools. We've heard about cures. We've heard about diagnosis. To you, what are the best tools to invest in order to further support prevention as a start, to start as upstream as possible?
I think it's difficult to say. I think there is no one right way. I think it needs to be a mixture of tools to support prevention. But just to go back slightly on terms of availability, one of the nice things which has come out of the Commission is the new veterinary medicines regulation, and that will open up the centralised authorisation, so a Europe-wide authorisation to many more products, and with simplified labelling to allow multi-country products, that should make a difference to the availability. But in terms of tools to support prevention, I think there is a lot being done. There are, from our own field, there's for some of the pharmaceuticals, the immunomodulators, things like that, to improve the health status of an animal. There's also the dietary side of things. Yeah, there is a lot, I think, to be done in terms of the diagnostics. So it's obviously key to prevention. The earlier you detect the disease, the much easier it is to prevent it getting elsewhere. We can also, in those terms, look at what they call the smart farming. There's a lot of systems in there which are relatively inexpensive, some of them, which can make a big difference in early detection of disease. I'm thinking, there's things like cameras linked to computers which analyze the gait of the cow as it wanders to the milking parlour and can tell if it's lame, and things like that, which are relatively simple but do work. So, and I think that, but I think it's not just one tool or one spot, and there's also animal breeding, animals that are more resistant to certain diseases in certain areas. And I think that's something we went away from. A lot of the old breeds were specific to a very specific area and the needs of that area, and then we moved to the more commercial, and farms got bigger and wider. But I think now we're moving back into looking at those more specific breeds for conditions. And it's to use a mixture of all of these tools together. I think that's the point. Is, as Nancy was saying, it's how you convey that to the farmer to actually make the difference on the ground. A lot of these tools are already available. There's more research and innovation going on, but there is also that last step to make the farmer aware and to tie it all into his systems and to make use of it.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you see opportunities for an increased cooperation between the GBAD programs and DISCONTOOLS?
Most definitely, yes. And certainly Johannes and I have been talking about this for maybe 3 or 4 years. We haven't really come to any great conclusion about how we do that. And Alex, or myself, have also talked about this with regards to STAR-IDAZ. I think some of the things I'd kind of like to pick up on, one is kind of where did we find the positive stories? All the panel have talked about the successes we've had so far, the fact that livestock health has been driven largely by economics. And we've got some great success stories across Europe in terms of managing transboundary animal diseases. I know we have problems at the moment emerging, but we've had success stories with regards to eradication of foot and mouth disease, classical swine fever, the management of different diseases in those sort of production settings. And I think to actually target those and actually present them as cases of really strong returns on investment would actually be quite a positive thing from the animal health world perspective to sort of think about that more carefully. So that'd be one area that I think we could sort of look at and take that forward. I just want to pick up on what David was saying a minute ago, where, you know, what is the balance between curative and preventive medicine surveillance issues? Starting first of all with surveillance, we tend to report things back about whether we've got disease or whether we don't. We might look at prevalence or incidence levels, but we rarely look at that in terms of the burden of those diseases in a society. And I think if we could do that, put a sort of dollar term or a euro term against that burden of disease, that would be something that perhaps might have a bit more impact with some of our decision makers and our policy makers. So actually converting that surveillance information into something that's economic is something that I think will be of benefit to us as we move forward and we start to develop bigger and better business cases for investment in the animal health world. I think there are situations with livestock production where certain technologies are not accessible and are not likely to be accessible. But as those production systems change, then the accessibility of those technologies will also change. And I think, again, we can work together to actually explore that a little bit more carefully, rather than banging our head against the brick wall, wondering why farmers are not doing things. Actually understand that currently their access, their financial situation and their returns on investment of particular technologies might not be at that stage where they can actually usefully use the technologies we have available. So I think actually looking at that from a sort of social and economic perspective becomes quite important. And then the final thing, you know, I do hope, and we are moving in this direction. I want to make sure we have a kind of very coordinated process of delivering better information on the livestock sector, the animal health world, to actually provide information back to DISCONTOOLS so we can deepen and understand this better. And my example of this is the way human health has developed this particular field. They've had an ongoing program on the global burden of disease since about the 1970s, 1980s. They now do annual publications on the impact of human diseases in different groupings. That has become a sort of information source about how they move forward. I hope we'll see that in the near future with the global burden of animal disease, and that information will become useful for DISCONTOOLS as they prioritize both diseases and technologies within those diseases. And I suppose the final point, you know, we need to think about how we link back into that human health world. So how are we using that information on human health? How are we using the WHO foodborne disease estimations to actually show that we're moving towards better animal health issues, better livestock production, and better food availability? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Now we're going to move on to questions from our audience, and while you all prepare your own questions here in the room, I'm going to take the first question we have received online, and I'll start with you, Jonathan, on this one actually, because there is definitely an economic aspect to it. Which sector should pay for which aspect of zoonotic disease control, and how can such decisions be made?
Thank you. That's a question from Glyn. My answer in the chat was that we do need data to understand what's being spent in different parts of the livestock sector. We currently don't have that in Europe or anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm aware, except in the pet health world, of course. Pet health data on expenditure is being captured. So that will be my first starting point. And then we need to understand a little bit better where the actual impact of those zoonotic diseases actually take place. This is really problematic. So I'm going to take the example more of foodborne disease issues, but if you think about what happened with salmonella in Europe back in the 1980s, we had certain salmonellas controlled by the poultry industry and others not controlled. And the ones that weren't controlled were the ones not causing economic impact in the sector, but they were actually causing public health issues in the human population. So actually having an understanding about where that impact lies and actually how we sort of manage that becomes quite important. So I hope that kind of answers a bit of that question with regards to negative externality issues. We have a problem with things like brucellosis. Again, it causes some impacts at farm level and it causes some impacts in public health. but actually there's not enough impact at farm level for farmers to actually do very much about it. So actually having an understanding about that balance between where the impact sits becomes quite critical. That obviously requires quite a detailed understanding of the value chains and the production systems that we're working with and the farming systems that we've got. So it's not a straightforward answer. And, you know, Glyn, if I was going to say one aspect that we could perhaps think about in DISCONTOOLS would be, what do we really know about the value chains and the farming systems that we're actually looking at with regards to these animal health issues? So I hope that kind of starts to answer the question without being too waffly. Thank you.
Thank you. David, I'm going to turn to you. So who should pay for what and who decides?
I think, as Jonathan said, it's very difficult. You've got to understand, you know, where the impacts are. And with anything, you know, some people will be more directly impacted. Others, it's a secondary impact or a potential impact. And that's, I think, is where Jonathan and the economics comes in, working out actually where are those, yeah, if everything goes right, you know, those sectors never get an impact. But if it goes wrong, they're heavily impacted. And I think you can look at where you get those impacts. I'm thinking back to the last foot and mouth outbreak in the UK. Yeah, there was a lot of talk to start with about the impact on farms and farming and food chain. But one of the ones that it was realized after a little while had a big impact was tourism. Yeah, but nobody thought about tourism at the beginning, that would be impacted. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of work to do there to try and work out exactly where the impact is and where the costs are best placed.
Would anybody else like to add something on that particular question, or can we move on to the next one? I don't see any raised hands. So do you have questions in the room?
Thank you. So probably it would be some additional question to Jonathan, probably. So we have mentioned today, and overall, there's quite a lot of the challenges brought by the global movement of people, workforce, animals, and foods of animal origin, and so on. And whether, Jonathan, you or your group has done some research, or do you have some perspectives also to carry out the research on how to assess current efficiency of the control systems and the related policies? So we have a social sciences, we deal with the concrete effects and so on, but do you see that some kind of activities in that direction could be done as well? There's quite a lot of, how to say, challenges brought that we know that diseases don't have borders, and we have quite a lot of challenges in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. We are broken up in different work streams within the Global Burden of Animal Disease Programme. We have economists looking at that kind of wider economic impact across the value chains and the wider economy. So we will be trying our best to sort of capture how this ripples across different sectors. Obviously, one of the biggest challenges is that quite often we perceive that the major beneficiaries of our work are producers, but I think the major beneficiaries are actually consumers, and possibly the value chain. Depends a little bit on how that value chain's been sort of brought together. So that's one aspect that we do want to look at. There are also interesting conundrums where, you know, the outbreak of African swine fever in parts of Asia may well be a benefit to poultry producers or aquaculture. So actually looking at how these things ripple across the economies and how people respond in a resilient sense becomes quite important as we move forward. And of course, any trade impacts of a disease for one country may create opportunities for another. Well-documented cases are things like the occurrence of BSE reporting in the US created an opportunity for Australia in the Japanese market, which remained pretty strong for quite a long period of time. So my analogies here are that with any kind of economics, it's a bit like squeezing a tube of toothpaste. So you push at one corner and it comes out somewhere else. David is totally right in terms of that tourism part, that many people went out of business during that FMD crisis because of those problems. But the money was spent somewhere else in the economy, so there were other people who gained from that process. So the winners and losers in this part tend to be quite important to document and understand quite carefully. as we sort of move forward. I'm not sure that really quite answers your question, but within our program itself, we are thinking about that. We're not at the stage to give many conclusive answers, and we will be looking for partners to explore that a little bit more carefully. Thank you.
I have another question here, and I will start with maybe you, Nancy, on that question before I move to our other speakers. Do you think it should be a priority for Europe, i.e. the EU, i.e. I suppose the Commission, to invest more in biosecurity, particularly in view, for instance, of the African swine fever epidemic? And do you think it's Europe's role to do so?
I think, to be honest, that a lot is done already. And again, there it is the actual implementations on the farm that is the most important. So there has already quite a lot of research be done. So, yeah, we have to continue to promote it, of course. But I think less from research and more from actual implementation to support the implementation of biosecurity in farms.
Yeah, well, I was going to turn to Paula first because I could see you nodding enthusiastically there. So
I'm not sure if I have much to add to what Nancy mentioned. I mean, I can only subscribe with what she just said. I mean, biosecurity is something not so expensive actually to apply. To be honest, it's one of the cheapest tools that exist to be implemented at farm level. Of course, depending on the production system, you can implement some measures or others that will give for another, let's say, full day seminar to discuss about that. But as also, I wanted to maybe go back to what David mentioned. It's not just a question of just biosecurity, just vaccines, just immunotherapy, just you name it, antibiotic treatment. It must be a combination of all of them. So to have a holistic approach again to the treatment and keeping the health of the animals in the highest possible, and also the welfare, as we were saying. I mean, they get intertwined. If you have good health, you have good welfare, and the other way around. If you have good welfare, you probably even, as the Commission was mentioning, we can even reduce or use less antibiotics, but always not forgetting that if the animals get sick, again quoting David, we have to treat them. And antibiotics do not have any alternative now, let's say, as an equal alternative, let's say, in the market. So we have to keep that also in mind.
Susanna.
I would say yes, everything has been said, yes. But I will also say that experience has shown that a good biosecurity works. I mean, so we know it works. But I totally agree with Nancy, it's a matter of implementation. And this morning, I was actually thinking when our Spanish colleague was talking that, yes, it's very important that you realize the level that you are on. You can't just put some biosecurity measures in place if the farmers, what you could say, the layout of the farms is not suitable for it. You have to fit it so it is actually feasible to manage it within it.
Do we have another question in the room? Yes.
Thank you very much. It was a question for Jonathan. When I hear your talk, it seems so obvious that the economic aspects of animal disease should be defined better, so that the impact should be better defined and calculated. Why? And that's one thing. And the second is well, in a large project like the partnership that we are putting together, there should be an economic aspect, or should be the economic dimension should be included in one way or the other. Why have we forgotten that? Why are we seeing? Why does it seem that we have not included the economic aspect in this partnership? Are we talking different languages? Don't we talk to each other enough? What is the reason? Thank you.
Jonathan.
I'm not sure, but I would say that I've done this kind of work for 30 years, and there aren't very many of us. I think it probably reflects the fact that the livestock health sector is not very big compared to human health. So type in human health economics, you'll find journals, conferences, MSc courses, a whole range of things that are actually ongoing, because human health is so much bigger. We spent $8.5 trillion last year on human health. I'm not quite sure what we spent in animal health because the figures aren't available. So the actual field is smaller, and the level of investment is smaller. And I think what I try to emphasize in the talk is that so far we've done okay through a process of simply muddling along with the kind of data we've got. So if, as I think Nigel has put in the comment, that, you know, if the impact is clear on farms, then farmers will spend money. We've been sort of satisfied with that. If the impact is across the society, then we may spend money, but it might take 20 or 30 years before we get convincing arguments to actually get investment and legislation change and coordination organised in that structure. I suppose the difference, what I'd say at the moment, is that I think we can do better with economics. I think we can add more value. And I think we can get better economists than myself, for example, to come forward and actually contribute to the thinking and how we move that forward. So one of the things that we are trying to do through the program is actually build momentum with economists and actually get better buy-in with economists to actually understand how they may well contribute to that process. And I think we can learn lessons from the human health groups that are probably about 30 years in advance of us in terms of looking at this more carefully. I don't think we should forget either that all these areas are quite new. Epidemiology really only started in the 1970s. Cost-benefit analysis, which we commonly use as a tool, only started in the 1960s. So the application and improvement in the livestock side is still quite new, and we're still sort of finding our feet in terms of how best we use it. Again, I'm not sure I've answered your question entirely, but that's my kind of feeling at the moment. And I think we can do better in terms of standardizing our approaches so we can actually do proper comparisons. And we haven't really done that yet so far in our field.
Thank you. Final question in the room? No, I don't have any.
I would like to add
Yes,
a
sure.
comment, because I would like to mention that actually the legislative approach towards animal health control has changed a lot. Now we have launched the new animal health law, and in this animal health law, it's not just a piece of document where we have collected all the different legislation, but it's also a change of approach. It's much more towards sanitary policy instead of eliminating the animals, and it's also much more towards prevention than curement. And there's also a lot of possibilities in the new legislation towards using new technologies for surveillance and animal identification. And if you look into the Article 36, you can see that it is also possible. I think there's a very few diagnostic methods that are prescribed. You can use science-based laboratory methods, and also there is much more focus on using vaccination of animals instead of eradication procedures. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we have no further question, I'd like to ask each of you in one word or one sentence to sum up your feeling or your next steps or your takeaways from today's discussions in general, and of course our panel in particular. Not an easy exercise, so who wants to start? Yes, please do, Nancy.
Well, I think we're at an extremely exciting moment in time, because a lot is happening. We have emerging diseases, we have changing production methods, we have changing societal concerns. We heard it all. But on the other hand, also a very optimistic way forward. We have a strong legislative framework, like was already said. We have a lot of new technology that became available with sequencing, but with data capturing, AI, things like that. And we have a well-coordinated sector, a small sector that is resilient and flexible, and with a lot of expertise, which we heard today. So yeah, exciting, but also very promising.
Good. David?
Yeah, I think for me, the take-home message is we need to continue to innovate from the basic research through to the finished product, either a commercial product or a tool for the farmer to use, and to communicate that to make sure everybody is aware of it.
Paula?
Yes, so subscribing also what Nancy and David mentioned, I would like to maybe bring three concepts to this wrap up. One is that One Health should be the key word for the future and will be also following the new legislative changes that we are seeing and that Susanna was mentioning. One Health is not just animals, it's not just humans, it's not just environment, it's the three of us, and we have to cooperate among us to reach the possible targets in the One Health concept. Secondly, I would say a phrase that probably everyone knows, that prevention is cure. So it's not just a matter of treatment the animals. Of course, we need to treat the animals, but we can apply, as we mentioned, a lot of prevention measures to avoid that the disease is coming to our farms. The last one we mentioned was biosecurity. We talk about vaccines and other methods. So everything counts at the moment of keeping our animals healthy. And the third will be a phrase that we like a lot in the European platform of reduced use of medicines in animals, in EPRUMA. It's as less as possible, as much as necessary. It's a phrase that, sorry to say, I was recently blamed to use it as an agribusiness motto. Sorry, it's not. It's just a fact. It's something that we all defend because it's true. Mm-hmm. It's something that we need. That's something that has to be applied. And this applies mainly to, of course, treatment, not just for antibiotics, but for all treatments for animals and for plants. You have to be able to treat the life beings that you are taking care of. So I will leave that on the table for future reflection. And of course, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Susanna?
Yes, now you stole my keyword. Because actually prevention is better than cure should be mine. Because this is what was the policy in the commission, and I was actually written it down. So you made it difficult for me. But I would go back to the One Health, because I think if we are going to make One Health come true, we need much more cooperation between the different services in the countries as well, so that the veterinary authorities work together with the medicines, the human medicines services, but also the stakeholders and the industries around the agriculture. Because if we don't do that, we don't find out where we have our borders towards one another and where we can do our cooperation in the best possible way. But I also would like to mention that I think that responsibility is a key word, together with cooperation and digitalization. Thank you.
Thank you. So Jonathan, you had the opening word, you're going to have the closing word. What's your main takeaways?
I want to go back to what Johanna started with this morning, which was population change, human behavior are driving challenges across the world in terms of pandemics, disease emergence, re-emerging disease issues, climate change. And I feel we need to have a better understanding of the kind of social and economic context in which we operate in the animal health world, in order to actually improve our decision-making process and understand when we've got opportunities to make constructive change. I think there's lots of things going on which are really positive in that light, but I hope that we can improve the way we use economics and social sciences to improve decision-making in the future. Thank you, and thank you for everybody for bearing with me online. I wish I'd been there today. Okay, thank you, bye-bye.
We hope you're okay, and that's the main point. Thank you very much to our panelists. Please stay here for the last few minutes of the conference. And I will now turn to Johannes for some concluding remarks.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you all for staying and thanks you for the very nice discussion. But I want to start these last words with a big thank you. Big thank you for the Animal Health Europe team. So Yasmin, Deborah, because really without you, this organization would not have been possible. So maybe I would like to do a small applause. But I also want to say to the audience here physically and online that by being here, you made a statement that you care for animal health. Because it's not evident to organize this kind of meetings in these times we're still in. This event, it will also kick off a new updating cycle for DISCONTOOLS diseases. So we've been working more or less 5 years on the different diseases. From tomorrow onwards, I will be contacting you, chasing you to provide inputs for new disease chapters. So I hope you can excuse me for that. I also hope that, yes, let's say in another 4 or 5 years, we can again have a similar meeting like that. I hope you agree with me, it was productive. It was good to have the physical contacts again, and so on. Not every year, it would be too much, but maybe in 4 or 5 years. So while we do an update, again, the information on the gaps, in the meantime, let's especially work to fill the gaps, as we've seen in several initiatives today. Therefore, I would like to make pleas to all of you, disease experts. May I count on you to provide new disease updates? To the funders, may I make pleas to make more interesting calls, and also, as we heard, maybe not only how to divide the cake and prioritize, but also increase the cake and step up your level of research in animal health research. To companies, may I make a plea to deliver on the gaps that we've all heard on, to develop sustainable business cases, and to engage more in public-private partnerships. To universities, I would like to ask, yes, enthusiasm your students to make interest and careers in research, so we can continue to be a living and bright community. Researchers, continue to follow your curiosity, as it's the best way to have great inventions. I'm almost there at the end of my list. Policymakers, create a good research and innovation environment and foster development of solutions across the epidemic, the endemic, and the zoonotic diseases. All of them are equally important. Practitioners, I know not many practitioners are here, but Nancy, I look to you. You represent the practitioners. Make optimal use of the new tools that are created through research to work on animal health, and also be ready for maybe the wave of digital tools that we may especially be expecting in the near future. And then finally, to consumers, although I know, well, we are all also consumers, I would say be open to accept new technologies and believe they can contribute to a more sustainable way of keeping animals once they're being proven and science-based, and there's a strong evidence base for them. So if we all play our role, we can set the best animal standards, deliver on the sustainable development goals, and leave a healthy planet with healthy animals and healthy people. And with those words, I would like to conclude and thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes. That's a very targeted wish list. So it's the second wish list we've had today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us, either here in the room or online. Thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their views with such enthusiasm and such expertise. And well, I think we've been talking about health all day. So my only wish now is to wish you to stay safe and have a very nice evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.